It started as a humanitarian mission. It became an economic model. On paper, the numbers worked: 53,000 barrels of oil a day. But part of the payment wasn't money, it was doctors. And when a country starts paying for energy with people, any disruption becomes a financial crisis. And what looked like partnership can be the delayed trigger of an inevitable collapse. The ledger was balanced, on paper. 53,000 barrels of oil per day flowing from Venezuela to Cuba, paid in part with cash, in part with 15-year financing at 2% interest, and in part with something that had no line item in the budget: doctors. 450 Cuban physicians were already working in Venezuela in October 2000, treating survivors of landslides that killed 15,000 people in December 1999. The medical missions had started as disaster relief. By the time Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez signed the cooperation agreement on October 30, 2000, they had become the foundation of a new economic model. The contract formalized what both governments already understood: Cuba had skilled labor the world valued. Venezuela had oil Cuba desperately needed, and the exchange could be structured to avoid the dollar-based international market that had shut Cuba out since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The agreement was celebrated as South-South solidarity, a rejection of neoliberal trade rules, and proof that revolutionary governments could survive without bowing to Washington or the International Monetary Fund. It was also a gamble Cuba had no margin to lose. Cuba's economy had contracted 35% between 1989 and 1993, the years immediately following the end of Soviet subsidies. GDP collapsed. Imports fell 75%. Calories and protein intake dropped by more than 30%, triggering epidemics of optic neuritis and neuropathy across the island in 1993. The government called it the special period. For Cubans, it was starvation dressed in bureaucratic language. By 2000, the economy had stabilized but remained fragile. Tourism dollars helped. Limited market reforms, legalizing the US dollar, allowing small-scale private agriculture, bought time. But the core problem remained unsolved. Cuba's energy infrastructure depended entirely on imported oil, and after the Soviets left, there was no reliable supplier willing to extend the kind of long-term credit a country barred from international capital markets required. Venezuela under Chavez offered exactly that. The oil for doctors model allowed Cuba to import fuel without depleting hard currency reserves, to maintain its power grid and transportation network, and to present the exchange as an export success for a socialist economy that produced little the global market wanted to buy. The decision to accept and expand this arrangement was never formally debated in public. It didn't need to be. By the time the contract was signed, Cuba had already committed to the structure. The question wasn't whether to rely on Venezuela. The question was whether Cuba had any alternative. It didn't. The agreement specified that Cuba would receive up to 53,000 barrels per day for 5 years. Venezuela would supply the crude and refined products. Cuba would pay partly in cash at market rates, partly under concessional financing. The remainder would be covered through compensation agreements, medical services, technology, agricultural expertise, sports training. The medical missions were the most visible and politically valuable component. By 2008, more than 30,000 Cuban doctors and health professionals were working in 70 countries. The largest contingent by far was in Venezuela. The structure worked. Shipments began in December 2000 and proceeded without interruption until April 11, 2002, the date of the failed coup attempt against Chavez. During that 16-month period, Cuba received over 25 million barrels and made payments totaling $439.7 million. After Chavez returned to power, shipments resumed. The relationship deepened. In 2004, the agreement was renewed and expanded. By the mid-2000s, Cuba was importing close to 100,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, far more than the original contract specified. Estimates for the value of Cuban services, primarily medical personnel, ranged from $1 billion to over $2 billion annually by the late 2000s. The political logic was clear. For Chavez, Cuban doctors allowed him to deliver health care in rural and urban poor communities where Venezuelan physicians refused to work, reinforcing his image as a champion of the dispossessed. For Cuba, the oil kept the lights on and provided the state with hard currency. Venezuela paid the Cuban government directly, and the government paid the doctors a fraction of the contract value, retaining the rest. Cuba's medical diplomacy had existed since the 1960s, but it had never before been the primary engine of the economy. In the 2000s, exporting healthcare became Cuba's largest source of foreign revenue, surpassing remittances, tourism, and all traditional exports combined. By 2015, health services exports were generating over $8 billion per year. The entire model rested on Venezuela's ability and willingness to continue supplying oil on concessional terms. That assumption was embedded in every budget projection, every long-term energy plan, and every macroeconomic forecast produced by the Cuban government. The risk was not hidden. It was structural. Cuba had replaced dependence on the Soviet Union with dependence on a single oil-exporting state whose political stability, fiscal discipline, and production capacity were all vulnerable to external shocks. Oil prices, U.S. sanctions, domestic unrest, mismanagement of PDVSA, corruption, capital flight, collapse of non-oil sectors, hyperinflation. All of these were observable dynamics in Venezuela by the mid-2010s, and all of them directly threatened the oil supply that kept Cuba functional. None of these risks triggered a fundamental reassessment of the dependency. Cuba did not diversify its energy sources. It did not secure alternative suppliers with comparable credit terms. It did not reduce the percentage of electricity generation dependent on imported oil. It did not restructure the economy to reduce energy intensity. The decision to build an economic recovery around Venezuelan oil had been rational in 2000. The decision to maintain and deepen that dependency after 2010, when Venezuela's economic deterioration was evident and accelerating, was not rationality. It was inertia shaped by the absence of alternatives and the political cost of acknowledging the vulnerability. By 2014, Venezuela's economy was in crisis. Oil production began declining. Inflation accelerated. Shortages spread. The government under Nicolás Maduro, who succeeded Chavez in 2013, faced growing protests and economic collapse. Yet oil shipments to Cuba continued, even as Venezuela struggled to supply its own refineries and power plants. Cuba's medical missions did not shrink. If anything, they expanded. By 2018, there were over 20,000 Cuban doctors in Venezuela. The number of personnel sent abroad in all fields, doctors, nurses, teachers, engineers, reached over 50,000. The compensation structure became more opaque. Testimony from defectors and reports from human rights organizations described a system in which Cuban medical workers were paid a small fraction of the contract's value, had their passports confiscated, faced surveillance, and were prohibited from leaving their assignments without state permission. The Cuban government denied these characterizations, framing the missions as voluntary and the payments as consistent with Cuba's salary structures. What was clear was that the revenue stream depended on maintaining a large deployed workforce and on Venezuela continuing to pay. Both conditions were under stress. Venezuela's oil production fell from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to under 700,000 barrels per day by 2020. Sanctions imposed by the United States starting in 2017 and intensified in 2019 cut off access to U.S. refineries and financial systems, further crippling PDVSA's ability to operate and export. Cuba's oil imports from Venezuela declined accordingly. By 2020, shipments had dropped to an estimated 35,000 to 40,000 barrels per day, well below the levels of the 2000s. By late 2025, that figure had fallen further, to under 35,000 barrels per day. Cuba's power grid began failing with increasing frequency. Blackouts that had been occasional in the 2010s became routine by 2021. The Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant in Matanzas, one of the island's largest, was over 40 years old, operating with outdated Soviet-era equipment, and required maintenance that could not be completed because spare parts were unavailable due to both the U.S. embargo and Cuba's lack of hard currency. The fuel supply disruptions compounded the infrastructure problems. Even when plants were operational, they often lacked the diesel or fuel oil needed to run at capacity. In October 2024, the national grid collapsed entirely for the first time. The failure began when the Antonio Guterres plant went offline unexpectedly. Without sufficient reserve capacity, the entire national electric system disconnected. The restoration took days. Hospitals operated on backup generators. Water pumps stopped. Communication networks went dark. Public transport halted. The government blamed the U.S. embargo. That was part of the story. The other part was structural. A grid built around imported oil, dependent on a single supplier with no domestic production and no meaningful investment in alternative energy sources. Renewable energy infrastructure, solar, wind, had been discussed for years. Pilot projects existed. But the scale required to replace imported oil as the backbone of electricity generation would have required capital Cuba did not have and could not borrow. By 2025, Cuba was receiving less oil from Venezuela than at any point since the agreement began. The reasons were multiple. Venezuela's production had collapsed, U.S. pressure on tanker companies and insurers made shipments riskier and more expensive, and the new Venezuelan government under Delcy Rodriguez, installed after the U.S. military operation that removed Nicolás Maduro in January 2026, was negotiating directly with Washington and had halted all subsidized shipments to Cuba. The U.S. operation was conducted on January 3, 2026. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were extracted during a raid on a government facility in Caracas. 32 Cuban security personnel, part of Maduro's protection detail, were killed. Havana declared national mourning and vowed resistance. Washington made its position explicit. Cutting off Venezuela's oil to Cuba was a strategic objective. The Trump administration warned that any country continuing to supply Cuba with fuel would face tariffs and sanctions. Mexico, which had sent some shipments, paused deliveries. Russia, which had provided limited supplies in prior years, did not increase them. No alternative supplier stepped forward with terms Cuba could afford. By mid-January 2026, Cuba's diesel reserves were critically low. Gas stations ran dry. Buses stopped running. The government ordered emergency measures, reduced work hours for all state employees, suspension of non-essential industrial activity, rationing of electricity to a few hours per day in most neighborhoods. Food distribution, already strained by years of economic contraction and the collapse of domestic agricultural production, deteriorated further. Refrigeration became impossible without power. Transport of goods from rural areas to cities required fuel that wasn't available. The blackouts in February 2026 coincided with an unusual cold snap. Cuba recorded freezing temperatures for the first time in its meteorological history. Families turned to wood and coal for heat and cooking. Water service, dependent on electric pumps, failed for days in many areas. Inflation, already in double digits, accelerated. The peso, which had been devalued repeatedly since 2021, lost further value. The government printed more currency to cover budget shortfalls. Prices in the informal market, the only place most Cubans could find basic goods, rose weekly. Migration surged. More than 13% of Cuba's population, approximately 1.4 million people, had left the country between 2021 and 2026. Most headed for the United States via Mexico or directly by sea. The exodus drained the working-age population and reduced remittances, one of the few remaining sources of hard currency. Cuban doctors abroad began defecting in larger numbers. Reports from Venezuelan exile organizations documented hundreds of medical personnel abandoning their posts and seeking asylum in third countries. Others simply disappeared from the missions, making their way to the U.S. or Europe. The Cuban government could not replace them at the previous scale. Domestic healthcare services, already under strain, suffered as the most experienced physicians were deployed abroad. Hospitals lacked medicine, equipment, and electricity to operate consistently. Mortality rates for preventable conditions rose. The medical diplomacy model, once presented as a triumph of socialist internationalism, now functioned as a mechanism for extracting revenue from a captive workforce sent to a country that could no longer pay reliably. By February 2026, reports from Havana described gas lines stretching for blocks, empty supermarkets, prolonged blackouts, and a palpable sense that the system had reached a breaking point. The government continued to frame the crisis as the result of U.S. aggression. That narrative had political value domestically and internationally. It was also incomplete. The crisis was not solely the product of external pressure. It was the result of a decision made in 2000 to structure Cuba's economic survival around a single partnership with a country whose stability was never guaranteed, whose economic model was unsustainable, and whose political trajectory was shaped by forces Cuba could not control. The Oil for Doctors Agreement had allowed Cuba to survive the special period without abandoning state control of the economy. It had provided a revenue stream that replaced Soviet subsidies and avoided the political cost of liberalization. It had bought time. What it did not do was build resilience. It replaced one dependency with another. The Soviet Union at least had the fiscal capacity and geopolitical interest to sustain subsidies for decades. Venezuela in the 2000s had neither. By the time Venezuela's economy began collapsing in the mid-2010s, Cuba's energy infrastructure, fiscal accounts, and foreign exchange reserves were so deeply intertwined with Venezuelan oil that there was no exit strategy that did not involve economic contraction, blackouts, shortages, and political instability. The warning signs were visible for more than a decade. Oil production in Venezuela was falling. PDVSA was hemorrhaging technical capacity. Capital flight was accelerating. Sanctions were tightening. The political system was fracturing. Cuba did not prepare for any of these scenarios in a way that reduced the dependency. It could not afford to. The cost of building alternative energy infrastructure or securing diversified oil supplies required capital that could only be accessed through international credit markets Cuba was locked out of, or through economic reforms that would have required abandoning central planning and state monopolies. The political calculation was clear. Maintaining the dependency was less risky in the short term than the reforms required to eliminate it. That calculation held as long as Venezuela continued to supply oil. It broke down when Venezuela could not. The removal of Maduro in January 2026 did not cause Cuba's collapse. It accelerated a process that had been underway since Venezuela's production began declining in the mid-2010s. What had been a slow erosion became a rapid unraveling. President Trump stated on February 9, 2026 that Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. Cuban officials responded that the island would never surrender its sovereignty, even under economic siege. The historical record, however, suggests that sovereignty is not the variable under negotiation. The question is not whether Cuba will abandon its political system voluntarily. The question is whether the system can continue to function when the material base that sustained it for 2 decades, Venezuelan oil on concessional terms, has been severed. Cuba survived the loss of Soviet subsidies in the 1990s through a combination of limited market reforms, tourism revenue, remittances, and eventually the Venezuelan partnership. Each of those mechanisms is now either exhausted or insufficient. Tourism collapsed during the COVID pandemic and has not recovered to pre-2020 levels. Remittances remain significant but have not offset the broader economic contraction. Market reforms implemented in 2021, including the unification of the dual currency system, triggered inflation without stimulating growth. And Venezuelan oil is gone. There is no sixth mechanism waiting in reserve. China and Russia, the two powers most aligned with Cuba geopolitically, have not offered subsidies at the scale Venezuela provided. Both have economic interests in Cuba, nickel, biotech, military installations, but neither has demonstrated willingness to cover Cuba's energy deficit unconditionally. The collapse, if it comes, will not be a single event. It will be a series of compounding failures, grid blackouts that last weeks instead of days, fuel shortages that halt all non-essential transport, food distribution systems that break down entirely, hospitals that cannot operate, and water systems that fail. The government will attempt to manage the crisis through rationing, emergency decrees, appeals for international solidarity, and repression of dissent. The population will continue to leave if routes remain open. Those who stay will survive through informal networks, black markets, and mutual aid structures that operate parallel to the state. What will not happen is a smooth transition to an alternative energy model or a diversified economy that reduces dependency on imported oil. That transition required time, capital, and political decisions that were not made when they could have been. The Oil for Doctors Agreement signed in October 2000 was rational. The decision to deepen and maintain that dependency without building redundancy was not. The cost of that second decision is now being paid in blackouts, shortages, and the slow disintegration of the systems that sustain daily life in Cuba. Venezuela did not collapse Cuba. Cuba built its recovery on a foundation that could not hold, and when the foundation cracked, there was nothing underneath. The ledger was balanced on paper. The oil flowed, the doctors were sent, and the lights stayed on. Until the oil stopped, and the lights went out, and the paper burned.